Bengal, 1943. The air here is not merely hot, it is heavy and adhesive, saturated with a cloying, nauseating stench. It is the smell of rotting rice abandoned in warehouses and decomposing bodies that no one is left to bury. Along the dusty roads leading to Calcutta lie those who no longer have the strength to walk. These are not soldiers fallen in battle, nor victims of bombardment. They are skeletons draped in dark, parchment-like skin. Men, women, and children whose lives are flickering out in the wealthiest agricultural province of British India. In their eyes remains a silent question, to which the empire already has a cynical answer prepared. If one of these dying souls could lift their head and look toward the Bay of Bengal, they would behold a scene of staggering, cruel irony. Across the calm waters, a heavily laden merchant ship cuts through the waves. Its hulls are packed to capacity, filled with golden Australian wheat, tons of grain capable of saving thousands of lives in the coastal villages sail past. The captain of this vessel is strictly forbidden from docking at an Indian port. His course lies further west, to Europe, to the shores of the Mediterranean and the British Isles. The grain that could have been Bengal's salvation becomes nothing more than a figure in London's logistical reports, a transit cargo for which the life of an Indian peasant is not considered sufficient reason to stop. This scene is not a mere literary sketch, but the historical reality of the time. While food ships bypassed the Indian coast, one of the most horrific humanitarian catastrophes of the 20th century unfolded on land. The scale of the tragedy that befell Bengal still shocks researchers. By various estimates, the famine claimed between 2 and 3.8 million lives. That is the population of an entire small European country, vanished in agony in just a single year. Statistics are dry, but behind every digit in these million-strong reports stood a slow, excruciating death from starvation amidst the indifference of the metropole. For years, official British historiography attempted to present these events as the result of a crop failure, a natural cataclysm, or the consequences of the Japanese threat. It was claimed that a cyclone and crop diseases stripped the region of food. However, the facts suggest otherwise. This was not a natural disaster, but a man-made hell. While people ate grass and roots, significant food reserves remained within India itself. Moreover, military supplies for the British Army and the Allies continued uninterrupted, and the export of grain from the starving country never ceased. The famine of 1943 was the result of cold arithmetic. It was a catastrophe of distribution, engineered artificially. Food existed, but it was locked behind high fences guarded by colonial bayonets or hauled away via railways and sea. Access to rice and wheat was cut off not by nature, but by the signature of bureaucrats and the strategy of the war cabinet. The tragedy of Bengal exposed the true essence of the relationship between the metropole and the jewel in its crown. At the moment when London was scrupulously calculating gold, sterling, and the balance of war expenditures, people in Bengal were dying not from a physical absence of food on the continent, but because they had become redundant in the imperial ledger. Their lives were struck through by the decisions of a colonial administration that preferred to maintain financial stability and strategic reserves at the cost of millions of its subjects' lives. This famine was not an error. It was the price India paid for British gold, the drain of India's wealth. To understand how the starvation of millions in Bengal became possible, One must look away from the rice fields of 1943 and toward the bank accounts of London in the preceding decades. The famine did not emerge from a vacuum. It was the logical culmination of a long systematic policy that economists call the drain of wealth. From the late 19th century through the interwar period, the British Empire constructed a sophisticated mechanism that allowed it to pump real resources out of India in exchange for worthless promises. For many years, a continuous stream of gold, silver, valuable raw materials, and export earnings flowed out of the colony. Indian textiles, spices, jute, and grain were sold worldwide, but the profits from these transactions did not settle in the pockets of Indian producers or strengthen the local economy. Instead, Britain seized real assets, leaving behind paper obligations in London promissory notes that India could neither cash in nor use for its own development. This system became particularly lethal through the mechanism of so-called blocked sterling. The essence of it was simple and ruthless. Payments for Indian goods sold abroad were intercepted by the British financial system. The currency earned through the sweat of Indian peasants and workers accumulated in special accounts at the Bank of England. These funds never returned to the Indian reserve system. Effectively, the colony was stripped of its financial cushion. The foreign exchange earnings, which could have guaranteed stability during times of crisis, were frozen in the metropole, serving the interests of the pound sterling rather than the rupee. Modern economic research allows us to estimate the scale of this plunder. Renowned economist Utsa Patnaik, having studied tax and trade data spanning nearly 2 centuries of British rule, reached a shocking conclusion. The total volume of wealth drained from India is measured in trillions of dollars by today's standards. This was money removed from the colony's circulation funds that were not used to build irrigation canals, hospitals, or roads that could have prevented a humanitarian disaster. India was bleeding financially long before the war ever knocked at its door. However, the most cynical episode in this history was the situation that unfolded during World War II. Official statistics of the time painted a paradoxical picture. India was formally listed as a creditor to the British Empire. On paper, London owed Delhi colossal sums for resources supplied and participation in military operations. But this was a financial fiction. The credits recorded on the accounts remained purely virtual figures that the colonial administration was not permitted to use. The reality was quite different, material, and tangible. While Britain's debts to India grew in the ledgers, real gold, food, steel, and leather were being exported from the country in the opposite direction. India gave up its physical resources necessary for survival, receiving in return entries in bank books that could not be eaten. The country was caught in a trap. It fed and supplied the empire while remaining absolutely powerless to manage its own wealth. It was this financial depletion, created by the mechanism of blocked sterling and forced lending, that deprived India of its safety margin in the face of the approaching storm. War economy and profit inflation. As World War II closed in on India's borders, London was forced to finance massive military expenditures in Asia. The decision made by the imperial cabinet was pragmatic for the metropole, but lethal for the colony. India was effectively transformed into an internal war chest. The burden of funding the war was shifted onto the shoulders of the Indian population, not through direct taxation, but through hidden yet far more destructive economic mechanisms. According to economic assessments, the British government opted for a deliberate expansion of the money supply to pay for massive military contracts, airfield construction, and army supplies. The colonial administration triggered the printing presses. A flood of new, unbacked rupees saturated the market. The economic reaction was instantaneous and brutal. The prices of rice, cloth, and other basic necessities skyrocketed. For the Indian peasant, the rural labourer, or the urban worker, this was a death sentence. While market prices changed daily, the incomes of the labouring poor remained fixed, seeing almost no growth. People living hand-to-mouth suddenly discovered that their labour could no longer feed their families. Rice sat on the shelves, but it had become an unattainable luxury. In economic history, this process is known as profit inflation. Its essence lay in a cynical redistribution of resources. Through soaring prices and frozen wages, the real value of labour and produce was stripped from the poor and funneled toward the British war machine and its associated contractors. Contractors reaped windfall profits from military orders paid for with hot money, while the state secured necessary resources without paying their full price in real terms. Researchers point to a direct link between this strategy and the Keynesian wartime economic policies applied in a colonial context without any of the safeguards of social protection. It was an invisible famine tax. Instead of seizing grain directly by force from every peasant, the state ensured that the peasant was forced to sell everything they had just to survive or die from the impossibility of purchasing food. Inflation became a weapon of war, siphoning the lifeblood of Bengal to fuel imperial defense. In this scheme, famine was not a side effect. It was an economically rational method of suppressing civilian consumption to meet the needs of the army. Policies that triggered the famine. The price crisis sparked by inflation might have remained a severe economic episode, but specific administrative decisions transformed it into a mass slaughter. The British administration, fearing a potential Japanese invasion through the eastern borders, applied scorched earth tactics on its own territory. This was known as the rice denial policy. Surplus grain was forcibly removed from the coastal districts of Bengal so that it would not, theoretically, fall into enemy hands. The enemy never reached these areas, but the reserves that could have sustained the population vanished into guarded government warehouses. An even more devastating blow was the boat denial policy. In the Ganges Delta, a region webbed with rivers and canals, boats were the circulatory system of the economy, serving as roads and trucks. Authorities confiscated or destroyed tens of thousands of vessels, from small fishing boats to large commercial barges. This paralyzed the region's lifeblood. Fishermen lost their means of subsistence, and peasants and merchants could no longer transport grain from areas with surpluses to starving villages. Internal trade and market supply mechanisms were intentionally destroyed by a single stroke of a military strategist's pen. Against the backdrop of this logistical collapse, a monstrous paradox unfolded. While mortality rates rose geometrically, India continued to export food. Official data indicates that tens of thousands of tons of rice and wheat left the country's ports. This volume would have been sufficient to feed hundreds of thousands and quell the panic in the markets. Yet the grain was diverted to supply British troops and allies in Ceylon and the Middle East. At the same time, any requests to import food into starving Bengal were systematically blocked by London. The standard pretext was a shortage of shipping due to the intense situation in the Atlantic. However, this argument appeared cynical, given that ships were consistently found to export Indian goods and grain out of the country. Archives preserve the correspondence of that time, dispatches from local Indian officials, and even the Viceroy, sent to London with desperate pleas for urgent aid. In response came cold refusals citing war priorities. The tragedy of the situation was later confirmed by the official Famine Inquiry Commission of 1944. In its final report, it was forced to admit there was no fatal shortage of food on an all-India scale. There was a catastrophic failure in distribution, exacerbated by war and the policies of the centre, which prohibited the free movement of grain between provinces and destroyed transport infrastructure. People died not because food did not exist in nature, but because access to it was cut off by the decisions of those in power. Churchill, racism, and cynicism. Behind the dry logistical figures, economic calculations, and military dispatches lay something deeper than mere bureaucratic indifference. The decisions that condemned Bengal to death were made by men with a specific worldview, and the figure of Prime Minister Winston Churchill is central here. The attitude of the British elite toward Indians played perhaps a decisive role in why the pleas for help were ignored. Historical documents have preserved extremely harsh, bordering on hateful, statements made by Churchill at the height of the tragedy. When reports of millions of starving people arrived, the Prime Minister, according to the records, placed the blame on the victims themselves. His infamous comment that Indians breed like rabbits and that it was their demography, not the removal of food, that caused the disaster is well known. This argument allowed the metropole to shed its moral responsibility. If the nature of the locals was to blame, then saving them was not mandatory. The particular cynicism of the situation is highlighted by Churchill's reaction to a telegram from Delhi, describing the horrific scale of mortality and requesting urgent grain shipments. Instead of ordering aid, the Prime Minister sent a scathing inquiry. If the famine was truly so terrible, why Gandhi hadn't died yet? This rhetorical question demonstrates not only a personal animosity toward the leader of the Indian independence movement, but also a deep-seated racism permeating imperial governance. The suffering of colonial subjects was perceived as a political bluff or a tiresome nuisance. Researchers interpret these facts in different ways. On one hand, it could be argued that Churchill did not intend to deliberately kill millions of people, but in the conditions of total war, he made a conscious and cruel choice. A well-fed Europe and the supply of the army were his absolute priorities, while Indian lives were viewed as an acceptable loss. On the other hand, a more stringent view regards London's policy as a form of biopolitical warfare. In this paradigm, the lives of colonial subjects were completely devalued and turned into a resource. Indians were sacrificed not by accident, but systematically, for the sake of preserving Britain's financial power and strategic reserves. Their right to life was annulled so that the balance of sterling and grain in the metropole could remain stable. The tragedy of 1943 stands as bloody evidence that, for the empire, gold and imperial ambitions weighed more than the millions of lives of those it promised to protect.